All right, let's try a little thought experiment. I want you to imagine every single person on Earth. Not shouting, not cheering, but screaming, all at the exact same time. That's 8 billion lungs, creating one single synchronized sound. What would actually happen?
You know, this exact question came from one of you, Amy. And at first glance, it feels like one of those fun, harmless what-if questions, right? Would it just be this bizarre moment of pointless noise? Or would the planet itself somehow notice?
Well, let's just dive right in, because the answer is not what you think at all. The consequences are real, they are physical, and they are surprisingly severe. See, this isn't really about noise. This is about physics.
To really get this, we have to change how we think about a scream. It's not just a sound you hear with your ears. It's a physical event. It's a forceful, frankly violent rearrangement of the air molecules all around you. It's pressure. It's raw energy. And when billions of people release that energy all at once, the atmosphere has no choice but to react.
So, first question, how loud would it actually be? This is where our intuition just completely falls apart, and it's all thanks to something called logarithms.
So, let's get a baseline. A single person screaming their lungs out can hit around 110 decibels. That's, well, it's like having a motorcycle engine revving right next to your head. It's painful for sure, but you'll survive it. But what happens when you add nearly 8 billion more?
And here's the trick. Sound doesn't add up like we think it should. Two people screaming isn't 220 decibels, because the decibel scale is logarithmic. It's only about 113, a tiny jump. But when you keep adding people, when you scale that up to 8 billion sources all at once, the math becomes absolutely terrifying. The combined sound pressure would blast past 180 decibels in any populated area.
And just to put that number into perspective for you, 120 decibels is where sound starts to cause physical pain. At 140, your eardrums rupture. Once you get over 170 decibels, the sound pressure wave itself can physically damage your internal organs. So we have to be clear, this wouldn't just be loud, it would be physically violent.
For a bit of historical scale, think about the eruption of the volcano Krakatoa back in 1883. It was one of the loudest sounds in recorded history. It ruptured the eardrums of sailors thousands of miles away. That was a volcano. This time, the source of the cataclysm is us.
And this is where the physics gets even weirder. At this kind of intensity, the sound stops behaving like sound, and it starts behaving like a shock wave. The air around us literally forgets how to act normally.
We have to keep coming back to this idea. Sound is a pressure wave moving through the air. And at 180 plus decibels, you don't just hear it with your ears, you feel it with your entire body. It hits you like a physical blow.
And that impact would be immediate. The sudden spike in pressure would shatter windows, but they wouldn't just crack. No, they'd explode inward. Any loose objects on your desk or shelves would become little projectiles. Eardrums would rupture instantly, not just from the volume, but from the sudden massive imbalance in air pressure. Oh, if you happen to be in an enclosed space, like a tunnel or a subway, it gets much, much worse, as that sound wave reflects and amplifies.
And just as a quick funny aside, if this whole thing were to happen near Niagara Falls, it would technically violate the 1950 International Treaty on the Preservation and Enhancement of the Niagara River. I imagine the International Niagara Board of Control would be drafting a very sternly worded letter, assuming they could find any paper that hadn't been blasted off their desk.
But the effects go way beyond just the pressure wave. We actually have to think about the air itself, the sheer volume of air that's being moved all at once.
So think about the mechanics of it. First, 8 billion people all take a deep breath in at the same time. Then they all exhale violently in a scream. All of that air gets shoved outwards, creating that pressure front we were just talking about. But what's left behind? In the immediate wake of that wave, you'd get these momentary pockets of low pressure, almost like tiny, localized vacuums.
And that leads to this deeply unsettling, horrifying experience. Imagine the scream stops, and you instinctively try to take a breath, but you can't. Not because there's no oxygen, but because the air itself, the physical stuff your lungs need to pull in, has been violently shoved somewhere else. For a brief, terrifying moment, there's just nothing there to breathe.
This pressure change would also do a number on our buildings. See, they're designed to handle wind from the outside, but not a synchronized blast of pressure from the inside, so they wouldn't just collapse, they would flinch. Ceiling panels would drop, weak walls would crack, and a rain of glass would pour into city streets. And believe me, a flinching building can be just as dangerous as a falling one. So, we've covered the environment. Now let's get to the really visceral part of this whole thing, the direct damage to the human body.
A full-force scream puts a massive strain on your body. In this scenario, millions of people would tear their vocal cords instantly. The tiny blood vessels in your throat, the capillaries in your eyes and ears, they'd burst. The sheer strain of that exhale could even cause collapsed lungs. And for anyone elderly or with a pre-existing condition, it could easily trigger a stroke or rupture an aneurysm. The very act of participating would be an act of self-harm.
And here is the really grim irony in all of this. The people who would suffer the most severe internal injuries are the strongest adults, the ones who can scream the hardest. Their ability to generate more force just means they do more damage to themselves. In this one bizarre scenario, being weaker is actually a survival advantage.
Now, the scream itself might only last for a couple of seconds, but the consequences and the sound itself, that would linger for much, much longer.
All that energy doesn't just disappear. It would bounce off buildings, off mountains, even off the clouds. The entire atmosphere would ring like a giant bell. For minutes after the event, there'd be no silence, just this decaying, global roar. Animals would panic. Mass disorientation would sweep through any species that relies on sound to survive. To them, it would sound like the planet itself was breaking apart.
So, does all of this combined energy actually move the Earth? Maybe knock it off its axis? No, not even close. The total energy is still completely trivial compared to the mass of the planet. The Earth would notice. But that's the wrong question. The right question is, does it hurt us? And the answer to that is a definitive yes, badly.
And this, really, is the biggest takeaway from this entire thought experiment. The real danger isn't the scream itself, it's the synchronization. Our entire civilization, our infrastructure, it's all built on the assumption that we behave randomly. We don't all speak at once. We don't all flush our toilets or turn on our lights at the exact same moment. Our systems depend on us being staggered and chaotic.
In the end, the scream would be this pointless act of accidental self-destruction. It would accomplish nothing at all, except to prove that perfect unplanned coordination is one of the most powerful and dangerous forces that humanity can unintentionally create. We're safe, it turns out, because we're chaotic.
So to answer Amy's question, yes, it would absolutely do something. Not because a scream is powerful, but because we all did it together. It really makes you think. So, if you've got a question that sounds completely ridiculous, but it just won't leave your brain alone, leave it for us in the comments. Sometimes the most absurd questions have the most serious answers.